So one of the complications with gaining excess body weight, specifically excess body fat, is something referred to as insulin resistance. And now insulin is a hormone that has receptors on the muscle, the adipose tissue, and even the brain. And when it binds to the receptor, it causes a series of proteins to begin functioning inside of the cell. And the main outcome is an increased uptake of glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids, and an increased storage of glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose, triglycerides, the storage form of fatty acids, and increased protein synthesis so we can store all of the amino acids. And now this is how we get nutrients out of our bloodstream and into the cells, and insulin is an extremely important hormone. But when we begin to lose insulin sensitivity, a lot of times this means that we're still producing insulin. However, there's some sort of dysfunction either with the amount of receptors or with some of the proteins that actually get activated in response to the receptor. And there are a myriad of things that can decrease our insulin sensitivity. But there are two main reasons why excess body fat seems to be specifically detrimental to insulin sensitivity. The first insult will actually come during the storing process. So when we overeat at a given meal, we have a lot of energy available. And insulin will facilitate all of this energy into the cell, which means we'll put a lot of burden on all of the cellular machinery to produce a lot of energy at one time because we have so much available energy. And as a natural byproduct of producing energy, we also produce what are called reactive oxygen species. To try and not overcomplicate this, the process of making ATP, which is our cellular energy, is kind of this delicate transfer of electrons inside of the membrane of each of our mitochondria. And at the end, we'll donate these electrons to oxygen to make water. However, every once in a while, one of these electrons will fall out. And instead of making water, we'll create what's called a reactive oxygen species. And these are things like hydroxyl radicals and things you may have heard of, like hydrogen peroxide. And these reactive oxygen species can damage some of the proteins that are responsible for the insulin signal, which means that even when insulin binds to its receptor, because some of the proteins are damaged, the actual signal isn't fully sent. Or there are specific disruptions in some of the signals and not others. With that being said, actually having fat stored inside of cells can produce something called a ceramide. And the only reason I'm telling you this is because I really like the name, but ceramides are referred to as sphingolipids. This is when we combine a sphingosine molecule and a lipid. And the reason this sphingosine molecule is so important is because typically we'll have lipids stored in what's referred to as a lipid droplet. And lipids are just fat. And this is because lipids are actually hydrophobic, meaning they don't like water. And the intracellular space is contained with a lot of fluid. So these lipids will accumulate in certain areas of the cell. However, when we combine a lipid with a sphingosine molecule, we create a ceramide which is not as hydrophobic. And what happens is, just like the reactive oxygen species can damage some of the proteins involved, a ceramide simply just tends to get in the way of some of these proteins or even bind to and inactivate some of the proteins. And once again, even when insulin binds to the receptor, the response is not sent in order to carry out a lot of the functions. And I'm not telling you that there are certain molecules that are better or worse for insulin sensitivity, because what really seems to be the worst thing for insulin sensitivity is simply just overeating and gaining excessive body fat.